This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
It might have taken a little longer to get to New Orleans than it did to get to other cities, but every kind of popular entertainment that was on the road in the United States made its way to the city sometime or other. If, as is often said, jazz is a musical style that lives through recordings, then it is with the music of those first musicians who left in February 1915 that our knowledge of the early New Orleans ragtime style begins. Once the New Orleans musicians began traveling, the easiest place to find many of the city's best artists was almost anywhere else, since that's where they found jobs. These were the traveling days of New Orleans jazz, and the story of the music has to be told in part through the stories of the musicians who were on the road. As the 30s and the bitter years of the Depression ground on across the United States, the reckless optimism of the jazz of the previous decade seemed more and more like someone's misplaced memories. Louis Armstrong had found a style of jazz that could smile its way through the hard realities, and for the small clubs and theaters that came through the dark years, the musical mood was an upbeat grin like Armstrong's. The city's unique jazz traditions continued to be part of its self-definition, but the consciousness of its role in the development of new jazz styles was also changing. At the same time, however, the first generation of musicians who had shaped the city's first syncopated styles and then developed them a step further into jazz were in their 40s and 50s now, and like musicians everywhere, they were beginning to look back on what they'd done, even if the bands they had created no longer were together, and many of them had almost stopped playing. The New Orleans musicians realized that their jazz style was still a personal expression for them. For many critics, there is something close to contempt for the idea that jazz might have originated in New Orleans. The current perception is that jazz's origins were a common discovery that occurred simultaneously in many places. The New Orleans style has also been a long-lived form that has continued to define and sustain its identity, so that there is a direct lineage from those first New Orleans groups to the thousands of musicians everywhere in the world today who still play within its stylistic boundaries. It has also over the years absorbed many of the other syncopated idioms into its own stylistic definitions. In part, its uniqueness is reflected in its resilience and its ability to absorb and reshape so many of the elements that have marked the social changes reflected in the country's musical idioms. The development of jazz in New Orleans was a continual cultural interchange between societies linked in ways that were more complex than can be easily comprehended. Every musician in New Orleans in 1900, white, black, and Creole, was drawing from the same sources: the syncopated cakewalks and walk-around pieces of the minstrel show bands, the newly popular syncopated melodies of ragtime, the disciplined music of the ever-present marching bands, the popular songs that drifted into town like seeds in the wind with the traveling vaudeville shows, and the sheet music that was found in nearly every home in each of the city's social and ethnic groups.